Get this out of your way. Good evening. I guess it is on. I'm Stephen Coburn from the Wharton School, and this is the panel on called Worldsourcing, but actually on outsourcing of service jobs. And we're going to expand the content of the program a bit from what's in the written agenda. We're really going to talk about the political, economic, social implications of outsourcing of all sorts of business processing jobs. Financial analysts. The emphasis to date has been on technology, software programming, call centers, just really what the economists called outsourcing of the back office. And there's been an explosion of interest in outsourcing of service center jobs this year. And again, just a wide range of jobs that are analytical, business processing, back office, mainly from the English-speaking countries, I think the US and the UK. We think of India, the Philippines, other developing countries. And everyone's been overwhelmed with the numbers, and I'm not sure how credible they are. I think you've all heard the estimate that by 2015, 3.3 million business processing jobs will be outsourced. 14 million jobs in the United States alone are vulnerable. I'm not sure how credible those numbers are, but it's certainly a phenomenon that, of considerable magnitude. And again, what we'll look at is the political, the economic, and the social impacts of outsourcing of service sector jobs. It's a very controversial topic. Let me give you two examples. There's lots of people arguing for outsourcing of service sector jobs. They argue, for example, that firms operate globally, that to be competitive, they need to hire qualified workers wherever they are in the world, that they need to hire workers to meet demand, to expand capabilities. You hear lots of people argue that the business model makes sense. And lots of people arguing, and I'm sure some of the people on the panel, that there'll be benefits to the countries that are doing the outsourcing, that jobs may be moved abroad, but companies cut costs, will increase profits, the profits will be reinvested, you'll end up with economic growth and better jobs, higher paying jobs, higher value-added jobs. On the other hand, you hear lots of people very concerned about the tendency. Arguments that thousands and thousands and thousands of white-collar jobs are chasing cheap dollars abroad. An American congressman recently said that the US is adopting third world countries, that there'll be permanent job losses, that we're in the midst of a jobless recovery, and that it's senseless to outsource lots of relatively high-paying, service sector jobs. It's a controversial issue. There have been a lot of sound bites, a lot of comments, but I think not a lot of informed and serious discussion, and I hope that we'll have that here this evening. What I will do is introduce the panelists, and then we'll turn to a general discussion. Mr. Francis Mer, who is to my right, who is Minister of Economy, Finance and Industry of France, will introduce the topic in just a second. Let me introduce the panelists now, and the forum has clearly seated them differently than the order on my sheet, so I will ad lib. On my far left, at least physically, is Patricia Hewitt, who is Secretary of State for Trade and Industry of the United Kingdom. Next to Ms. Hewitt is J.T. Battenberg, who is Chairman of the Board, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Delphi Corporation. On his right is Sanjay Kumar, who is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Computer Associates International in the United States. To the right of Mr. Mer is Jeffrey Joerres, who is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Manpower in the United States. And on my far right, I know physically only, is Philip Jennings, who is General Secretary of the United Network International, UNI, in Switzerland. Mr. Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm a bit surprised because up to now, I believe that we were speaking of R&D, and I discover with this NA warning that you have decided to change the subject.
Well, feel free
it's a curious way of organizing these meetings. So I shall try to keep with my own subject, because I think it's much more important than the subject you are trying to push us to discuss of. Even if outsourcing is not a subject, outsourcing is a normal way for corporations to optimize permanently their performance. And when they decide that it's better to buy than to do, they decide and they move, and they start to buy from the vicinity, and then they discover that the offer is better maybe in another country, and if the distance doesn't create a problem, this is a normal decision for them to outsource and to buy from another supplier in another country. So when I have said that, I say nothing, because it is, in my mind, the normal life of any corporation. It has been the case since 1 or 2 centuries. And the time is finished since a long time, where in any corporation you have the ambition to do everything. I remember in my former job that it was possible at the time, but it was 1 century ago, to imagine that the best solution to be successful was to take care of the babies, to take care of the mothers, to take care of the graves, to take care of the births, and to be like an island within the region where the corporation was working. Progressively, they discovered, and we discovered, that in order to improve the performance of the corporation, it was better to specialize. And so you decided, and we decided, and everybody decided that to focus on the core business was the solution. Then we discovered that the core business can be split in other businesses, and progressively, under the pressure of competition and the necessity to improve our performance, all the corporations are going in this direction. Now, when you speak of outsourcing, you discover that the largest part of the services to the business were formerly made within the corporation. Then they decided that accounting people were more performing if they specialized on accountants. So the corporation decided to outsource their accounting. It has been the same case for a lot of corporations for all the IP and all the telecommunication and so on. And it is a life. The life of the corporation, the life of the country, the life of the world. The sole new major event being that thanks to progress in technology, you can outsource at least only services without creating any problem, because of the fact that the information you need from the services are immediately on your computer for the reasons we know. So I stop on this subject, which is not, in my mind, the most important one. The most interesting one, at least vis-à-vis the way you intended to help us to be clever, was to speak of R&D, including of R&D in other countries, including of so-called outsourcing of R&D. It is clear that in our present world, which is a global one, that's to say unique, we are in front, in my mind at least, of a fantastic opportunity for growth for all the areas, if we understand the new rules of the game. And the new rules of the game imply the fact that some area at some time in the next decades will be focused on some part of the global world production, and some other, including here in Europe, will have to take care not only of what cannot be outsourced or cannot be imported, but we'll have to take care of the renewal of the offer. If we do not understand that in this world where there is a win-win game presently played, if we want to keep our system alive, that's to say open trade and so on, we absolutely need to understand as soon as possible in the western part of the world that the R&D effort and the R&D effort for renewing all the services, all the goods, taking the opportunity of the fantastic revolution presently existing through telecommunication and so on, is the solution for solving our European problems without preventing the others to take care of the fantastic opportunity given by our market to their products coming from India, from China, and so on. So either we agree that the new game implies a major change, a major movement for Europe, for USA, to the benefit of the others, and at the same time to substitute some activities by others, we shall, in that case, outsource within our own countries from some businesses to another one. Either we do that, and I think we have all the possibility to do that, and we use the maximum opportunity given by this globalization, or we forget, and sometime, I cannot say when, our countries will refuse to go on and play the game with the other countries, and we shall face a situation where the basic tool of international trade is more and more endangered by social reaction, political reaction of a lot of countries having not understood that the game they are playing implies for them, that's to say for us in Europe and for us in USA, to have a volunteer change in the direction of this increased effort for R&D. This is my starting opinion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yes, microphone. Let me turn to Sanjay Kumar and ask you a question. Outsourcing isn't new. I can remember a Business Week cover, perhaps 10 years ago, talking about the Hollow Corporation. It's a decade-old phenomenon. Why is there such attention paid to it right now? What's going on? Why this year? Why is it hot right now?
Well, that's a good question, Stephen. Maybe to kind of get to the question that you posed, I might want to put out a couple of definitions which may be helpful for our audience, and maybe even for the panel when we're talking about outsourcing. We're talking about three fundamentally interconnected but different kinds of work. Generally, when we talk about outsourcing, it's this concept of picking up some unit of work and giving it to a third party who's going to take on responsibility for running it, and generally it's a more complete unit of work. You're outsourcing manufacturing, you're outsourcing your entire data center operations, you're outsourcing the management of your network, for example, and outsourcing has been around for a long time. Companies like IBM today are very successful. Companies like Electronic Data Systems, CSC, many others have been extremely successful in this business. There's nothing new about outsourcing. They've been doing all around the world, by the way, not just in North America or Western Europe. Then there is this relatively new concept of offshoring. Offshoring comes in two flavors. The first flavor is when you give a third party some responsibility. It's offshoring R&D. It's offshoring a specific business function, and you're allowing that third party to worry about it, and they're taking it offshore. There's another form of offshoring, which is any one of our companies deciding to set up an international development center and doing the work ourselves. And then there's this newest kind of combination event, which is called business process outsourcing, or you hear the term BPO. And that's the idea of taking the back office and moving it out of North America, out of Europe, into places like India, China, Philippines, Mexico, and other parts, where people are taking accounts payable, accounts receivable, processing tax returns, and those kinds of things. And so there's been this kind of gradual migration enabled by technology, enabled by global economy, enabled by telecommunications and bandwidth and all those kinds of things. And I think it's gotten a lot of attention recently because we've started to hit on a segment of jobs that were untouched before. Outsourcing meant data center jobs moved. Outsourcing meant research and development jobs moved. Offshoring meant we were doing R&D for a long time. Manufacturing's moved out of the U.S. a long time ago. But all of a sudden, in the last year to 2 years, we started moving a whole new kind of job, call centers. And for the first time, broad swaths of the population started hearing about this, because you called up an airline reservations company and you found out the reservations agent was sitting in Bangalore, India. Okay? Their name was Sanjay, and on the telephone their name was Jay. You know? They had a strange accent, trying to be Midwestern, and you asked them the question, where are you? And they said Bangalore. And people started to get focused on the idea that jobs were moving. This being picked up by the media, I think, has gotten this thing in a full-scale kind of level of attention here. But I don't think it's anything new. So I think it's the combination of factors that have gotten us where we are today.
Thank you. Certainly when it's Wharton graduates' jobs that are being outsourced, it gets serious. And I mean that only half facetiously. Let me turn to Patricia Hewitt. And you were quoted in The Economist recently, and the quote, which may or may not be accurate, and you may or may not have said, but it's an interesting quote. The quote was that the myth that offshoring creates widespread, you were quoted as saying the fact that offshoring creates widespread unemployment is a myth. Now, we've heard about thousands and thousands of jobs being sent offshore, et cetera. Why is it a myth?
If you look at the United Kingdom, there is huge public concern about offshoring, and I think for exactly the reasons that Sanjay's identified, and for one additional reason, that in those parts of our country, and I would guess this is true in the United States, that were most dependent in the past on traditional manufacturing jobs, and those communities in particular that were devastated by the loss of those manufacturing jobs, call centers, came along and appeared to be the savior. And now people appear to see those jobs disappearing. We've had some high-profile announcements from major companies recently saying they're closing a call center in the Northeast, moving it to India. And so the myth is, oh my God, all these jobs are going to disappear. All our back office jobs will disappear to India or wherever, and we will have permanent mass unemployment. The reality in the United Kingdom is that despite, obviously, a very long process, and in many cases a very painful process, of manufacturing job losses and restructuring, and now more recently, some high-profile job losses in services, we have higher levels of employment. We have more of our population employed than we've ever had before. And we've seen unemployment, and especially long-term unemployment, fall over the last 6 years in every region and nation of the United Kingdom. And this idea that India and other countries are going to, swallow up every back office job, I believe is a myth. I've no doubt at all that India is going to grow back office and many other jobs. They have great competitive advantages. They're producing 250,000 highly educated IT and science graduates every year. So great competitive advantage there, but we are also growing call center jobs. And I mean high-end rather than the low-end back office and call center jobs. And we see some companies deciding to offshore part or all, generally part of their back office operations. We see others deciding, because for reasons of quality, customer loyalty and so on, they want to stay in the United Kingdom. We're seeing Britain attract some from the United States, which is interesting. And my view of the public policy response is that we have to protect our people without falling into the trap of protectionism. In other words, we have to make sure that our economies are growing and we're doing the structural reform and so on in a way that generates the new jobs, and then we help the individuals affected by this process of technological and global disruption move into the new jobs. And in terms of what Francis Mayer was saying about R&D and innovation, I absolutely agree with him. But I think that unless we, in the West, but also in the better off developing countries, we have to get better at managing the dislocations, which can be incredibly painful for individual workers and their families and their communities. We've got to manage those dislocations very well. And we, as politicians and you as business people, we have to be much better at really shaping globalization as something that is going to deliver benefits to people in our countries and to the people of the developing world, because otherwise we will get precisely that reaction against international trade and global interdependence of which Francis spoke, and which gives rise to the intense and I think very threatening protectionist pressures that we've seen, for instance, in the United States.
Thank you. Let me push that a little harder, and I'd like to come back to you later, Patricia Hewitt. But it seems to me, I read today that global unemployment is at an all-time high. Perhaps not in Great Britain, but in the world as a whole. And certainly the Western countries are not growing at tremendous rates per year. The question I have, and let me turn to Joerres from Manpower, what happens to the people that lose their jobs? It seems to me when it was manufacturing jobs, we could argue, although I suspect none of us believed it, that a shoemaker could be retrained as a computer technician. But there was certainly a lot of better jobs in the economy, a lot of room for, if not the shoemaker, the shoemaker's kids to move into more technologically intensive and better paying jobs. Isn't there a limit? If someone who does financial analysis or research and development, and I certainly agree with Mr. Murray's general point, loses their job, what better job are they going to get? Where's the upside? Where do they go?
Well, no doubt we're in a very dangerous time, and the reason I say that is because there is so much shifting that is going on. And what's happening is, you know, to emphasize your point, this has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. You used to go within your country and move to an area that might be less expensive. So agriculture moved and poultry moved to northern France. Well, now it's moving somewhere else. What's happening in there are two things. One is we are clearly seeing that the conversation in the press and the conversations within companies talking about moving offshore is creating unrest within the companies that they really do plan on still having employment in the country, but what they're doing is they're losing some of their best people. Because their best people are saying, I've got to go somewhere else. So what's happening is that. The other is, the reality is, if I move a manufacturing plant, which is one of the ones that have been easy to move over time, whether it be moving one from France to Romania or one from the U.S. to Mexico or on and on, what is happening is that person who's had the opportunity to make the equivalent of 30 euro or $40 an hour cannot be retrained to the point where they're going to be able to make that kind of income again. And that is the real conundrum and the real issue, which is what's happening in the middle class when it comes to moving out manufacturing, particularly, which generates most of the middle class. That's where the collaboration has to be between government and business to say, okay, we can create service jobs, but service jobs are not going to create a middle class for the most part. So it's the balance and the anticipation of saying some jobs will be moving, no doubt about it. Which positions are ones that create more economic impact within a country, and now how can we work together to try to replace that, because it's not going to be easy. We have many training programs where we've tried, and the dropout rate is tremendous that we've seen.
I still want to come back on this. Let me encourage any of the panelists that want to hop into any of these questions, so please do so. Still want to come back to the issue of what happens to a financial analyst that loses his or her job. And let me come back to that. What are the better jobs? There is some sort of a pyramid. Everyone can't be a CEO. And I think it's a question we'll come back to. Yeah, and if anybody
Are we on? Okay, I'll address it shortly and maybe U.S. focused. There are financial analysts and investment bankers and young investment bankers who were making a lot of money. They shouldn't have been. Shh. And there were some IT professionals who were making a lot of money based on Y2K that shouldn't have been. So there's a readjustment, a recalibration, that there's pain, but I'm not sure if that's an issue we should be addressing.
Okay. Let me turn to J.T. Battenberg, and I know that Delphi has global supply chains. Could you give us some sense, we've been talking the abstract, of what outsourcing of service job really means in your company, just get a sense of the reality of it?
Well, our perspective comes from living in the auto industry and in the consumer electronics industry. We have about 200,000 employees, full-time employees in 42 countries. Essentially, our headquarters is in Detroit, but we only have 30% of our workforce in the United States. 70% is outside the U.S. And the reason for that is very simple. The auto industry is expanding around the world very aggressively. And as that expands around the world, they want supply communities close by. They want engineering close by. And consequently, we end up setting up shop in around the world, wherever the auto industry goes. So, as you know, since 3/4 of the world has never even driven a car or truck yet, there's a lot of expansion that's going to occur in the next 20 years. So we're just naturally following that expansion. So, you know, we've got engineering tech centers now in 32 countries. 3,000 engineers in Mexico in a tech center. We just announced a $50 million tech center in Shanghai, and a large tech center in Korea, and so on around the world. We'll just continue to add our technology wherever the auto industry goes. We'll be there with them.
Thank you. Let me turn to Philip Jennings. You're basically a union.
Yeah,
we're union. You're union. You're dealing with job losses.
Yeah.
How do you deal with outsourcing of service?
How do we deal with it? First of all, we're a global union organization and we have members in 150 countries. So we're dealing with the anger, the anxiety, and the irritation when working people tend to hear about these decisions in the radio or in the newspaper without the CEO having the guts or the balls to tell them himself what's going on. And secondly, we're dealing with the excitement and the energy of India and other parts of the world. We, as a global union organization, therefore, have to try and build this bridge of how do you deal with this process of restructuring. Our people feel squeezed. The first wave of outsourcing, the core business and the peripheral business, was already a significant squeeze on aspirations and on manpower levels, and now our people are feeling even more squeezed. There's a lot of anger and irritation out there in the industrialized countries. So we're also being, it's not us that's responsible for the hype for once. And, you know, we've looked at Goldman Sachs and talked about 6 million job losses and all these other statistics which you've mentioned, Steve. And I've been asking people here, well, you know, is this hype, is it real? And then a very senior entrepreneur in this business said, Philip, we're in the middle of the hype cycle, whatever that means. So we've joined it, and we call this whole process the Global Mobility Revolution. We have a report. I don't have it with me. Give me a business card, we'll send it to you. And there is a strategy, and there has to be a strategy. Nationally, governments have to take responsibilities with respect to their people and preparing their people for change, where we're already seeing rapid turnover of jobs, people moving from job to job at a faster rate. People are sort of grown accustomed to not having a job for life, but they need the support and the pillars put in place in a national context. And I know in the UK, we've talked to our unions there, and in Patricia's department, a discussion has started. You know, it hit the headlines. Our people were out in the streets. We will fight for these jobs. This is not because we have anything against the Indian workers or the Filipino workers. We fight for these jobs. And sometimes we'd be saying uncomfortable things to attract ministers' attention to deal with it. So now we're making an analysis in economies around the place so that governments realize that there is something going on out there, but I'm not sure of the magnitude. It means that things have to happen in a European, in a regional sense. So we've put questions up to the European Parliament to look at this. We've started discussions with the finance employers, the insurance employers, the telecoms employers. You know, where are the jobs going? Let's have a discussion about it. It also needs a global analysis. Today we were talking with the International Labour Office about what this means in a global context, in a world where half the population survives on less than $1 a day, in a world where 90% of the working people don't have a pension. What I think it will do from a union perspective is reinforce international work. And maybe a bit later I can talk about globalizing organizing. I can talk about globalization of collective agreements. I can talk about the globalization of the dialogue with individual companies. I can talk about globalizing labor standards. All these things are happening. And my appeal would be on the trade issue. The WTO and the ILO have to talk. We want to talk about the ramifications of what these structural changes mean, and it ain't happening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Merck, can I ask you a question, if I may?
I'm very interested by what Mr. Jennings mentioned, because it is, as far as our subject is concerned, the core of the question. And he mentioned two ideas. The government needs first to understand what are the forces working in what direction and so on. I'm not sure that all the governments understand that as clearly as necessary. Then Mr. Jennings says, okay, I cannot refrain this movement, but I think it is necessary for the government to create conditions for taking care of the people on a responsible manner, taking care of the people losing their jobs in order to educate them and help them to find a new job. And we come back with, we go back to your example of how to transform a shoemaker in another educated job. This is the real problem. The major risk we face now is the speed of change. Because if this change was under control, it is not the case, we could imagine that on 2 decades, 3 decades, the subject is manageable. In fact, we have opened the box and we have freed all the movements, and it's normal that the corporation, in competition on a worldwide basis, are doing their best to remain competitive by outsourcing and so on and so on. Partial answer to the question is to create conditions in any developed, so-called developed countries, conditions enabling the people having a job to be sure that they remain employable, that's to say, capable to attract a new employer if they lose a job. Probably, seen by myself at least, and in my country, this is one of the key milestone to help and solve this problem. It's not impossible to achieve that. It goes through continuous training and so on, but it might minimize, not suppress, might minimize the risk described by Mr. Jennings. As far as the analysts having lost their job, I think that they are strong enough to take care of themselves by themselves. Okay?
Thank you.
Because it's provocative as an example. But I recognize that a call center, when it is removed from France to Tunisia or Ireland, or maybe someday India, because thanks to telecom progress in terms of cost, why not to put that in India? I remind us in that case that this job, call center, did not exist in Europe or in USA 10 years ago. So we have just the demonstration that we are in such a moving world that the life expectancy of businesses is, for a lot of new businesses, short. Because, I repeat, 20 years from now, there was more or less no call center. So we need to accept, because we have chosen that, and because it is not a zero-sum game, but a win-win one, we need to accept that in our Western world countries, the speed of change will increase. We need to accept that employers, the present employers of people, need to take care of the way these people will be put in a position to find a new job in their more or less qualification as long as they are still employed and not discovering the problem later on. That's to say when it is too late. And I think that with this solution, plus my idea, that's to say to reorientate drastically the efforts of a lot of corporations towards brains, towards educated jobs and so on, we can hope to master or to control more or less this evolution. But I do not deny with Mr. Jennings the fact that what is at odds is the possibility, like Mrs. Hewitt mentioned, the possibility to keep that under minimum control in order to avoid, I repeat, at some time, very strong negative reaction, destroying what we are trying to build on our world market without knowing exactly what to do, because we learn at the time where we progress, because it's life. But this life is, at the present time, evolving at a very rapid pace. And this is a problem.
Thank you.
I have no solution, but some ideas.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a few more questions, and I'd appreciate if we could answer them fairly concisely, because I want to turn to the audience very quickly. But let me come back to Patricia Hewitt. Support for free trade has not been overwhelming, even in good times. When I look at surveys in the US, even in boom times, only about half of Americans really support free trade and globalization. Is there a danger that, whether it's perception or reality, that the angst and anxiety spread by the outsourcing of service jobs, of white-collar jobs, of back-office jobs, is going to lower support for free trade and free flows of investment to the point where it really constrain our ability to reach new agreements?
Yes, of course that is a danger. We saw, steel tariffs imposed in the United States. Actually, the thing that finally, I think, persuaded the US administration to lift those steel tariffs wasn't just the fact that the WTO had quite rightly, in response to Europe's case, ruled them unlawful. It was the fact that they were damaging America's own manufacturing industry. And the American manufacturers came together to say, you've got to change this stuff. But, we're now getting, in the United States, state governments saying, oh, we won't do business with a company that has offshoring, has call centers in India and so on. Now, this is nonsense, but je suis tout à fait d'accord avec Monsieur Maire. I am completely in agreement with what Mr. Maire has said. And it's not always the case that Britain and France agree on absolutely everything. So treasure the moment, because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody outside a few scientists had heard of genomics. We now have, in Europe as well as in the States, a flourishing, growing bioscience industry. And what we have to do, government isn't going to sit here and say, we know what the jobs and products and businesses are going to be in 10 years' time. What we have to do is create the best possible environment for entrepreneurship, because a lot of the jobs are going to come from the new small businesses, and for existing businesses to grow. But entrenched businesses aren't always very good either at predicting where the new jobs and the new competition is going to come from. So innovation in the established businesses, as well as entrepreneurship from the new, free that up and grow the whole of the world economy, manage the pace of change. But if we think that the pace of change is difficult in rich countries, it is infinitely more difficult in the poor countries of the world. And we do have a very bad habit, we in the West, of demanding instant market opening and liberalization in the poor countries of the world while doing nothing whatsoever of the kind in our own countries. So a bit more consistency there and a bit more recognition of the need to sequence market opening in the developing countries to open our own markets, to deal with trade distorting subsidies, and to manage the dislocation, not for the financial analysts who look after themselves, but for people who don't have yet the skills and whose children don't have the skills and aspirations to cope in a high technology, fast moving economy.
Thank you. Let me ask a general question that anyone on the panel can answer, and then I really want to move to the audience. It's clear from J.P. Battenberg's comments and others that outsourcing benefits firms. It lowers costs, it's access to high-skilled labor, to diversity of labor. How does that translate into benefits for the economy that's doing the outsourcing? I mean, we can talk about very general terms about growth, et cetera, but if I were a union member or someone who was really concerned about this and came to you and said, people are losing jobs, tell me why it's good for the UK or the US or France, what's the answer?
I think it's about being competitive. This is a global economy. If JT was competing with somebody in his business who was based in China, manufacturing in China, he's got no choice. In the software industry, if one person does it, you have absolutely no choice because you have to compete. And the choice is being protectionist, be an ostrich, hide. I agree with the concerns about labor. I agree with CEOs standing up and saying, taking responsibility for what's going on and taking care of the people. I mean, that's an obligation I think we have on a moral basis. I mean, it's not legal, it's a moral issue, I think. And that's a whole different issue that transcends all of this stuff at a higher level. But I think it's a matter of being competitive. And I think that's very fundamental to any kind of economic policy program.
But that, in essence, if I can take the devil's advocate view, that's a negative answer. That's saying if we don't do this, we've had it.
Steve.
What's the positive answer?
Consumers. What about consumers?
They want lower prices.
If we'd said to European consumers, you can only buy European-made electronics, we wouldn't have had the consumer revolution in electronic gadgetry and the low inflation that Europe's been enjoying. Consumers want this stuff. They're getting great benefits from it. And as Indians become richer, more prosperous, their wages will go up, they'll compete on quality and not only on cost, they have to even already, and they'll buy more from us. That's how Europe, over the last 50 years, has grown richer, by pulling down the trade barriers. Let's do it across the world.
JJ has one.
I fully agree with what Mrs. Hewitt mentioned, because it may be an occasion to try and think what are the targets of any economic activity. The answer is the consumer. In the past, the consumer was under control by the state. The consumer was also a producer. And as far as the savings of the consumer, producer, they were also under the control of the state. We have given freedom of behavior for the consumer aspect of any person. They are free to buy what they want, where they want, through internet or directly through Walmart. They are free. And normally, a consumer decides his policy of buying just in connection with his selfish interest, except if some of them are trying to change the world just by changing their own behavior. The saving part of the activity of any person has been since 10 years or 20 years in Europe, totally freed. Now, any European citizen is free to decide and invest his savings where he wants, including in India, including in China, through the channels you know. And then you have the third part, the same person, producer. When you say what are the results of the outsourcing and so on, for economy, the answer has been clearly given to you. Economy is what is good for the consumer. And the answer is very clear. China has become this year, 2003, as the first supplier of France as far as all the textiles are concerned. Why? Not because the government has decided, but because each French citizen, male and female, has decided that the balance between cost and quality was better obtained by buying through the channel of distribution, you know, Chinese products. Good, and good for Chinese workers. So our problem, and I come back with my idea to bring something, our problem is we cannot change the behavior of the consumers because they are free. And up to now, we have not any intention to modify this point of our system, okay? We cannot change the freedom of the people to decide where they invest. So the sole problem we need to control and to manage is how to help the producers to remain producers, even if they are no more producers during all their life with the same kind of qualification and so on. This is the sole answer to our global question. And I repeat, it's not easy. And Mr. Jennings, I fully agree with what you have in mind. But it would be crazy to imagine that we shall globalize our collective convention and so on, because it is impossible to justify under the idea of freedom that the Chinese unions are obliged to follow the European or the American habits. They will decide by themselves for themselves.
I beg to differ.
Hang on, I'm going to let you have the last word. So,
now, I'd like to have a word in between, because then the audience is exhausted and I know what I'm going to say. Look, I can't do my job in China. I cannot organize people into free trade unions in China.
Okay.
If I try and do my job in China, I'm on the next plane out. It's a problem. And there's a larger issue taking place. Look, I've just talked to someone on the textile side. 1 million jobs are going from Bangladesh to China. 1 million jobs are going from Indonesia to China. There will be 30 million people in the textile sector in China. This is where this issue of free trade and rights really begins to animate people. What's been missing from the discussion so far is some of this has to be done for the pleasure of the shareholders, doesn't it? You know, and frankly, the pressures on CEOs to cut costs, to squeeze their employees, this is another layer of pressure. And I think there's some cynicism in it. But what I hope also comes out of this discussion is the opportunities for India in the Philippines and elsewhere. We find it exciting, the possibilities of these new generations of skilled Indian graduates producing, you know, 250,000 a year. And what we can do and what we are doing is talking about unions to them. And we do have agreements with companies. Last week, I signed a global agreement with H&M, 50,000 people. We have a global agreement with Carrefour. They have 300,000 staff. Now, we're not talking about it's going to be X per hour, but what we can say is that there will be some new considerations on working time, and that the people will have the right to organize, that they will have the right to negotiate. Give these people the opportunity to organize, and they will also bring their own pressures to lift up the conditions. And that's why this question of globalizing trade means globalizing organizing and globalizing the dialogue with companies, and it's happening.
thank you. Let me turn to J.T. Battenberg, who I know wanted to enter in the conversation.
Well, let me try and answer your question with a simple example. In my industry, China's auto industry, by getting it started, helping it, getting it focused, they now produce 4 million cars and trucks a year. They're the third largest producer in the world, behind Japan and the United States. Now, what that means for our employees or our employees in other countries is, while that industry gets started on its way from 4 million to 20 or 30 million, they're going to need, for example, integrated circuits. We happen to build our chips in Kokomo, Indiana with United Auto Workers. It costs $1 billion to build a chip factory. I'm not going to put another $1 billion chip factory in China for the next few years. I'm going to ship chips from the United States, from UAW, and help that industry get started. Same thing with intelligent electronic airbags. They want those electronic airbags in their cars in China. There's nobody that, and the same thing with diesel, the electronic fuel injection. They want the best Europe has. So we're shipping a lot of stuff out of Europe, a lot of stuff out of the United States, a lot of stuff out of Mexico, into China. Same thing in Russia. As Russia's just now getting started with their auto industry, although we set up a few plants there, we're shipping in all the high-tech stuff. And after Russia, then there'll be 5 or 10 years later another third world that's getting started. So there's a lot of opportunity to ship stuff around the world here, and that's going on big time.
Good. Let me ask one last question to Jeff Joerres. What's this doing to, you alluded to it before, what's it doing to loyalty? What's it doing to corporations' ability to retain people?
Well, I think it's a very dangerous thing. It's necessary. So what JT has to do and others, we see it in hundreds of thousands of companies. And the real issue is how you go about doing it, not whether you have to. Because if you don't, your company's going to go out of business. So if you shrink your population from 50,000 to 40,000 because you're offshoring some, my view is you're saving 40,000 jobs. Because if you wouldn't have shrunk it to begin with, all of the jobs are in jeopardy. So the real question is then, how do I describe what we're doing and why we're doing it to the 40,000? Because what we are clearly seeing is high-skilled engineers walking through our doors saying, I want a different job because I think my company's going to go offshore. And that's a tragedy for the company because that job may not, but they're nervous because they haven't been explained, and sometimes you just don't have enough facts, but you haven't been explained how to do it.
Okay, let me turn to the audience. Stephen Roach, if you can identify yourself and where you're, sure.
Stephen Roach, Morgan Stanley. Mr. Kumar, you said that, I think I wrote this down accurately, outsourcing isn't new. I think that misses a critical aspect of what's going on. I would put to you that IT-enabled offshoring in services is brand new.
That I would agree.
And that is the key issue here because, first of all, it has to be brand new because the Internet's brand new by definition. But this is a transforming event in the way that we look at macroeconomies. And a lot of you have touched on issues, but just bear with me for 30 seconds while I just hit this point. We've always thought of economies of having two sectors, tradables and non-tradables. Courtesy of the IT and raising educational attainments offshore, non-tradables are becoming tradable. With the click of a mouse, you can extract the knowledge content from India, from Shanghai, Eastern and Central Europe. And it's not just call centers. You're wrong just to focus on call centers. It's rapidly moving up the value chain from data processing call centers to engineering design, software programming, doctors, lawyers, actuaries, yes, even investment bankers. We're doing it. And so Minister Mayer's got the exact point that this debate, he threw it out, but then it gets dropped. This is about speed. And since it's IT-enabled, we have no idea of the hyper speed by which this has the potential to occur. So we can't just sit back and say, okay, this is the way globalization works. You know, we create jobs in India and China. They become consumers, and the world is better off. It is definitely reducing the cost of goods sold in the developed world, but it's very asymmetrical in the way it produces new consumers because Chinese producers are not consumers. They're savers. They're poor people. They have no safety net. Someday they'll become consumers, but not right now. So, well, my question, I apologize for this long-winded thing. My question to Minister Mayer or Secretary Hewitt is, what does it take to focus the debate on what you alluded to in genomics, really setting out the framework to emphasize the new sources of job creation that we must create an environment for rather than trying to hang on to jobs that are being rationalized through a rapid pace of globalization in some of our older industries.
May I ask that the panelists respond as concisely as possible so we can get to as many people in the audience as we can?
Well, you know, I would say we're on the right agenda. We've just published the latest of our thinking on how we raise the rate of innovation in the UK economy. And that's what this is about. It's about innovation, it's about entrepreneurship. And we need to do that right across the European Union. And we need to do it better right across the European Union. than perhaps we have done in the last couple of years.
Did you want to say something?
No, I think that the analysis of Mr. Roach is totally meeting mine and Mrs. Hewitt. When I have a nightmare on this subject, my problem is shall we be able to discover in the next years new opportunity as we did in some years ago for the new IT revolution, enabling us in the Western world to maintain the pace of renewal of the offer and at the same time to create acceptable conditions for in brackets, the workers. This is a problem. Nobody has the answer. But the sole way I try to optimize the positive aspect of the answer is to say the maximum people working on research will maximize, in terms of probability, the positive result of this research. That's to say new things, new subject, new activities. And if at the same time we optimize the quality of our education, we create the condition, even if maybe at some time it will be not totally coherent with the speed of change connected with the globalization, we create the condition for the Western part of the world to bring its value added to the system through this improvement of R&D. And I'll stop on this point to say that we need not to forget that the number of people, including in China, including in India, in terms of research, is so large that the probability of finding on a worldwide basis now has never been as high in the past. And so this is, for me, the way to be more reasonably optimistic than if we forget that this problem is not only a Western problem, but also a world problem. Don't forget, I repeat, the number of people presently looking for research, working in research in China and India.
Thank you. Jean-Louis, Jürgen, I'm going to, Phil, if I can move around and come right back.
Yes, precisely. I wanted to ask a
question. Could you identify yourself?
Jean-Louis Gergorin, European Aeronautic Defence and Space Company, EADS. I wanted precisely to ask a question to the panel in the field that has just been very brilliantly evoked by Minister Mayer. This is this issue of the offshoring of high-level R&D and engineering jobs, you know. And I think, Minister, you are right. But what we are seeing now is, among the young people, a decline of interest for the technology and science education. We see that in continental Europe, we see that in UK, to my knowledge, and we see that in the US. And so what should, if this trend is confirmed, I think it will be extremely serious and it will prevent us from succeeding the kind of entrepreneurial revolution that both Mrs. Hewitt and Mr. Mayer have evoked.
The answer is very simple, very clear. Our young students know that it is more profitable for them to start in the life as a lawyer or as a so-called banker. So, either these 2 or 3 or 4 or the large fields of employment reduce the level of the wages, or the people wanting to attract students in research increase.
Philip, and then I'm going to go back to the answer.
Entrepreneurship by itself is not going to solve this problem.
No, it will
not.
It
requires active labour market policies and a complete rethinking about how people can reskill, relearn throughout their working lives. Now, I don't know if the investment is actually being put in place to achieve that, and it also means a look at your education system, the way that subjects are taught, the content of your curriculum, and so forth. But just saying that entrepreneurship is going to solve this problem ain't going to work.
No, I have not said that, Mr. Jennings. I have not said that. I've just said, because the question was how to attract people in the scientific discipline with efforts. The answer is to demonstrate to them that if they are interested by this kind of discipline, they will be paid as good, as well as the others. This was the question. But as far as your own idea, I fully support your idea. It is clearly we need to rethink, redesign our education system and so on and so on. No problem with that.
Okay. I think we'd all agree that, at least from an American's perspective, if we can offshore lawyers' jobs, that to be an immediate impact on economic growth. That's one thing I can see. Yes, right there, please.
My name is Dr. Piramal. I'm the chief scientist of a pharmaceutical company in India. I want to make a comment on R&D outsourcing because I do a lot of work for global companies in medicines. And one of the points was made in the forum over the last 3 days is it costs $1 billion to make a new drug. And we think in India we can do it at $50 million. So there is a scale. And that $50 million, if that's the cost of the drug, it'll be like 10 cents for a pill, which will serve the 5 billion people worldwide to cure a disease. So in the end, the consumer, which isn't being served now by the very expensive drugs that you make in the United States, can actually be changed completely by reversing the pyramid of cost, by doing these kind of partnerships and outsourcing and R&D, and it'll be profitable for everyone. And it'll serve many more million people, even in the US, who find it very difficult to buy drugs today. So this is the benefit worldwide, I believe, in the field of medicine. What we're talking about is IT. I think you haven't seen anything yet. In histopathology, in medical testing services, that's some of the work that my company is doing in India.
Thanks. C.K. Prahalad? No, come to you.
First, I have to...
It's on.
Yeah, C.K. Prahalad from the University of Michigan. First, I have to thank the panelists for such a balanced view, because I think we tend to forget that there are 4 constituencies here: the individuals, the global companies, developed countries, and the developing countries. And like the 5 blind men of Hindustan, whenever you touch it from one perspective, you get a very distorted view. Even as individuals, people may lose jobs, but they benefit as consumers, which has already been talked about. $49 DVD is not possible without outsourcing. That we like to have, but we don't like to pay the price for it. At the same time, as investors, today you can invest in growth markets around the world. So if you take the 3 sides, it is not clear to me which one we are debating at this point in time. For a global company, there was an old article that was written a long time ago: who is us? I think it's an important question for us to debate. When JT talks about Delphi having 30% of its employees in the United States and 70% outside, who is us? I think in a global company, it is not at all clear where the loyalty should be. Because if you start looking at the historical development of the multinational company and say, therefore, you're rooted in UK or rooted in France or rooted in the United States, you must be loyal. How about 30,000 people who work for GE in India? Do you have a loyalty to them? I think it's an important question. And the third issue that I would like to raise is, and I agree with my friend here, Piramal, you haven't seen anything yet. I think we have just touched the tip of the pyramid. And I think when we think about outsourcing, we make a very interesting mistake, especially in the developed world, that the low-end work will go there, we will keep the high-end work. I'm going to argue you cannot do innovative high-end work without a foot in the door in China and India any longer. Just to give you an interesting example, I mentioned this morning. 5 years ago, when I was an entrepreneur and I went to get money from venture capitalists, and if I said, I want to do some of the work in India, I would not get the money. They said they're just too complicated, you don't have a clue.
Now it's reversed.
Today, if you don't have an India connection, you don't get even listened to. In other words, I think genomics, medicine, personalized healthcare, we can talk about all these. That's not going to be only the private preserve of UK or France or United States. I think we're moving to a much more fundamental restructuring of global industries, enabled by an equalization of access and equalization of transparency that cannot be stopped. And I finally come back to the one issue that I think most of you raised, and that's fundamental. we need to ask the question, are we doing right by the consumers to give them the appropriate choice? And I think that is finally where the rubber meets the road. Now, since Steve has been harking on this investment bankers from Wharton, I have to tell you, we also train investment bankers. One, they can take care of themselves. But more importantly, in the business school, we have to teach them new skills. For example, globalization of this kind means a new opportunity for project management, which is intercultural, not just interpersonal. How to manage projects on a 24-hour cycle across the world with multiple teams is not something anybody knows. And at least we are moving rapidly, not to teach them the old tools, but rapidly to new tools. And at any rate, these are smart kids. They'll take care of themselves. But the problem is a lot more important. And final word, the Western agenda is working. We forced globalization on the rest of the world. We forced free trade. We forced free markets. It is working. The asymmetric benefits we don't like, or asymmetric costs, but that's a temporary phenomenon.
Thank you. Let me, I want to turn to, I don't think I said investment bankers, and I'm not concerned at all about their future. The gentleman over there.
Yeah, while the mic's going there, can I tee up one more issue? And that is, I think the rate of technology change is such that the pace at which it's going to occur is going to get faster and faster and faster, right? I mean, the classic outsourcing has been there a while, but the offshoring concept enabled by technology is just going to happen faster. The next generation technology is going to make this so much easier to do. It's going to make your head spin. And I think there is a big gotcha here that people haven't thought about. I don't think we have an answer. I'll just tee it up, and that is, while India and China are benefiting, India especially today, from this whole offshoring phenomena, there are other countries who are looking around. I mean, I attended a meeting today with the King of Jordan. Let me tell you, he's got his eye out for a piece of that pie. And tomorrow, he's going to have the kind of skills that are going to be cheaper than India, and the jobs are going to go there. So we're going to build up a lifestyle and a level of expectation in India, only to find those things move away pretty hard because technology can enable it to happen. And I don't think those countries are ready for it yet.
Okay, let's take one last question, and then it's getting late. We're going to have to call this closed.
Thank you for interesting discussion. My name is Einar Schlesser. I am Deputy Prime Minister of Latvia. And it's very interesting to hear about India and China, and we have to accept that this is a reality. But in the same time, we have to remember that from 1st May there will be enlargement of EU. 10 new member countries are going to join EU, and this will make a big change in Europe. And I believe this is the first topic what Europe must think about. Today, if we are talking about outsourcing, if we are talking about back offices, this is going on already in Europe. In Latvia, we have already several companies which are doing business for UK and many other countries in Europe. If we look into Czech Republic, there is more than 100 Japanese producers which are doing production, not anymore in Germany or other countries in Europe, but in Czech Republic. In Poland, the same. And I believe 10 new member countries is quite big also power. And I believe through cooperation in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Europe can become much stronger. I believe that situation when I was in one conference in Munich 1 year ago, and there was interesting discussion about the situation in Germany. Costs are too high, salaries too high, taxes are too high. People would like to work less. They would like to have more vocation, yes. And the question is how we can succeed. It's difficult, yes. And I believe Eastern Europe will be able to help a lot, and cooperation is very good because not everything can be outsourced to China or India because many services must be outsourced to the direction which is much closer. And I believe if Western Europe will understand that we have to cooperate more in a new Europe after 1st May, this will be a good success story. Of course, China, India, no doubt, this will be strategic partners for different direction. Population are much bigger, but I would like just to hear from panelists, don't you agree that without cooperation with eastern part of Europe, western part of Europe will have a large problem? Thank you.
Can we have one quick answer to that question, and then we really do need to pull it to a close?
You know, for me, the enlargement of EU is, from an economic point of view, similar in terms of potential consequences, positively, than what the US decided when they created NAFTA. I think that even if it is maybe too simple, we can say that the competition brought by Mexico to US has forced US to react and to create the condition of productivity and growth and development of new businesses we know presently. I hope, like you, that the enlargement of EU more or less will bring the same positive consequences for our economy in the West in order to be more reactive, because as I think everybody understands, we have no other choice than to be flexible, reactive, responsive, and so on, and educated.
Thank you. Let me pull this to a close. This has been a fascinating panel, I think a very vigorous panel. A lot of viewpoints have come out. Let me reassure Patricia Hewitt that I do believe strongly that globalization is real, that an integrated world economy is here to stay, and that we all benefit from an open economy and free flows of trade and investment. That being said, I believe that this is a threat to lots of individuals in the developed countries. In the past, there has always been an assumption that somehow the benefits will trickle down, that the individuals who are displaced will get better jobs. That generally has not happened. Let me close by saying, I think this requires a real and a serious private-public partnership, and I think it requires governments to do more than play lip service, to side payments for people who are displaced if the economy as a whole benefits, to real retraining, and to ensuring that there is a social safety net, and to not pretend that everyone who is displaced, and I am not worried about lawyers and investment bankers, but that everyone who is displaced will not suffer individually, and that if the economy as a whole is going to benefit, which I believe it does, that every individual is better off. And let me close on that note. Thank the panelists and thank the audience. Thank you.